the elderly man thought his daughter-in-law was taking him to a nursing home. When he got out of the car, he was in for a big surprise. The car rolled steadily over the cracked asphalt of the narrow road, a soft hum filling the quiet air inside. Edward, an elderly man in his late 70s, gazed out of the window, his heart heavy with the ache of what felt like a betrayal. He had noticed the hushed conversations between his son and daughter-in-law, the way they avoided his questions lately, and the increased frequency of their visits to his small apartment. Today, they had insisted on taking him for a drive, though the solemn air of the day felt more like a funeral procession than a pleasant trip. Next to him, Melissa, his daughter-in-law, sat behind the wheel, her lips pursed into a thin line, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She hadn't said much since they left, which only deepened Edward's suspicion. He knew where they were going. The thought of it sent a cold shiver down his spine. A nursing home. He had heard the stories from friends, about how families, when burdened with an aging parent, would find a place to tuck them away, out of sight, out of mind. The idea of being left there to fade into the background of forgotten lives, sharing stories with strangers who might not even remember their own names, was unbearable. Melissa pulled the car to a stop near a building. Edward squinted, his stomach tightening. This was it. He felt the familiar knot in his chest, that dull pressure of being pushed aside, as if he were nothing more than a chore now. He took a deep breath and reached for the door handle, bracing himself for the sterile smells and distant faces that awaited him. But when he stepped out of the car, he was in for a surprise that would shake the very foundation of his assumptions. Edward hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling slightly as it gripped the edge of the door. He forced himself to take a step forward, his worn leather shoes tapping softly on the pavement. His eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for the inevitable sign that confirmed his fears: Brightwood Retirement Home or Golden Years Assisted Living, one of those names that tried to sugarcoat the reality of abandonment. But no such sign appeared. Instead, his gaze fell upon a charming white house with a wraparound porch and neatly trimmed hedges. The house looked nothing like the clinical, sterile nursing homes he had imagined. There were flower pots hanging by the windows, rocking chairs swaying gently in the breeze, and even a child's bicycle leaned casually against the porch railing. He frowned, confusion bubbling up inside him. "Where are we?" His voice cracked as he turned to Melissa, who had just gotten out of the car herself, her face a carefully guarded mask. She closed the door and walked around to his side, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I wanted it to be a surprise," she said, her tone almost too light. "Come on, let's go inside." She began walking toward the house, her steps deliberate, while Edward remained rooted to the spot. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. If this wasn't a nursing home, then what could it be? Was it a temporary stop before the inevitable? Or was it something else entirely? He glanced back at the car, half considering asking her to take him home, but curiosity and a strange, nagging hope pushed him to follow her. Melissa opened the front door, a wave of warmth spilling out. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted toward him, an unexpected comfort. Edward stepped inside cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the cozy interior. The living room was modest but homey, soft couches, a worn rug, and bookshelves filled with old, dusty novels. There were framed photographs on the walls, pictures of smiling faces he didn't recognize. "Melissa, what is this place?" His voice was firmer this time, his patience running thin. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was more to this house, to this entire situation, than met the eye. Melissa sighed softly and motioned for him to sit. "Please, Edward. Just trust me for a moment. It's not what you think." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the calm exterior she was trying to maintain. She sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. Edward's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He had known Melissa for years, but something about her now seemed different. There was a weight in her words, an unspoken tension that hung between them. She wasn't telling him everything. And that made him feel uneasy. Before he could press her further, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. A moment later, a figure appeared in the doorway, someone Edward had not expected to see in a place like this. Edward's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward. It was a man, about Edward's age, but with a spry energy that suggested he had weathered the years more kindly. His silver hair was combed back neatly, and his eyes sparkled with a warm, knowing gaze. Edward's mind raced to place him, but the familiarity of the man's face eluded him. The stranger smiled and extended his hand. "Edward, it's been a long time." Edward blinked, taken aback by the easy familiarity with which the man spoke. He stared at the outstretched hand, hesitant to take it, his mind swimming with questions. Who was this man? And how did he know him? Melissa, sensing Edward's confusion, stood up and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This is Jacob," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion. "Your brother." For a moment, Edward felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. His brother? It wasn't possible. Jacob had disappeared nearly 40 years ago, shortly after a bitter family argument. Edward had given up hope of ever seeing him again. But here he was, standing before him, as if no time had passed. "Jacob," Edward whispered, his voice barely audible. He searched the man's face, looking for traces of the younger brother he had once known. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing eyes, they were all there, but softened by the passage of time. And yet, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow a dream. Jacob's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "I know it's a lot to take in, Edward. And I owe you an explanation. But first, sit. There's something you need to hear." Edward's legs felt weak, and he slowly lowered himself into the armchair behind him. His mind was reeling. Why had Jacob reappeared now? And why had Melissa, of all people, been the one to bring him here? Melissa sat beside Jacob, her hands folded in her lap. "I didn't know how to tell you, Edward," she began, her voice trembling. "But your son and I have been in contact with Jacob for a while now. He wanted to reconnect with you, but under his own terms. We thought it was best if we arranged this meeting without telling you too much." Edward clenched his fists, a mixture of anger and disbelief rising within him. "You thought lying to me was the best way to handle this? Taking me here without explaining anything? Making me think you were dropping me off at some nursing home?" Melissa's eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But we were afraid you wouldn't come if you knew. We didn't want you to have any more reason to resist seeing him." Edward glanced between the two of them, his heart pounding in his chest. The betrayal stung, but more than that, he felt the deep chasm of unresolved pain from his past. Seeing Jacob again dredged up memories he had long buried, memories of their final argument, of the harsh words that had driven them apart. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Edward, I'm not proud of the way I left things. I was young, angry, and selfish. I should have never walked away from you or the family. But I've spent the last few decades trying to find my way back." The room fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Edward's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away, unwilling to show his vulnerability. He had lived a lifetime believing that chapter of his life was closed, and now, it had suddenly reopened. "What do you want from me?" Edward's voice was gruff, but there was a hint of desperation in his tone. Jacob stepped closer, kneeling in front of Edward. "I don't want anything except your forgiveness, brother. I don't expect us to be what we were. But I need you to know I'm sorry." Edward stared into Jacob's eyes, the weight of the years pressing down on him. He had long ago convinced himself that forgiveness was impossible, that the wounds were too deep. But now, faced with the man he had once called brother, he wasn't so sure anymore. The silence in the room grew heavier, each second stretching out as Edward struggled to find his voice. His mind raced through years of suppressed anger, confusion, and regret. He wanted to lash out, to demand answers for all the time they had lost. But at the same time, he felt a deep, gnawing sorrow for the brother he had missed for so long. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze flicking between the two men. "I'll give you both some space," she murmured, rising from the couch and heading toward the door. As she left, the soft click of the door closing behind her seemed to signal the finality of the moment. It was just the two of them now, two brothers with a lifetime of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Jacob didn't move. He stayed kneeling in front of Edward, his face etched with an earnestness that Edward hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. Edward felt the weight of his brother's presence, the memories flooding back unbidden. The fishing trips, the late-night talks, the arguments that had seemed so important back then but now felt small in the face of the years they had lost. "I never thought I'd see you again," Edward finally muttered, his voice thick with emotion. His eyes stung, and he blinked rapidly, unwilling to let the tears fall. "You disappeared, Jacob. You left me alone to deal with everything. Do you have any idea what that was like?" Jacob bowed his head, his hands resting on the edge of the chair. "I know I can't make up for the past," he said quietly. "But I've spent years thinking about it, trying to find the courage to face you. I know I was wrong, Edward. I know I failed you when you needed me most." The bitterness that Edward had kept buried for decades began to bubble to the surface. He clenched his jaw, the memories of those days sharper than he had ever let himself admit. Their mother had been sick, and their father had passed away not long after. Edward had been left to shoulder the responsibility, while Jacob, his younger brother, the one who had always looked up to him, had simply vanished. No letters, no calls, not a single trace of where he had gone. "You didn't just fail me," Edward said, his voice cold. "You failed our family. You walked away and left me to pick up the pieces. I had to bury Mom on my own. I had to figure out everything on my own." His hands trembled as he spoke, the anger he had long kept at bay now spilling out. "And you never even bothered to come back." Jacob's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his face contorted in pain. "I know," he whispered. "I know what I did was unforgivable. I don't have an excuse, Edward. I was scared. I didn't know how to handle the weight of everything, so I ran. And I've regretted it every day since." Edward stared at his brother, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all he saw was the same boy he had grown up with, the boy who had made mistakes, who had been weak and afraid. And despite the anger still burning in his chest, Edward couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Edward said, his voice softer now. The anger was still there, but it was tempered by the years of longing for the one person who had understood him better than anyone else. Jacob nodded slowly, standing up and taking a step back, giving Edward space to breathe. "I don't expect you to," he said. "I just wanted to try. To give you the truth, finally." For the first time, Edward noticed how tired Jacob looked, how the years had etched lines into his face, how his shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of everything he carried. In that moment, Edward realized that time had not been kind to either of them. They had both suffered in their own ways, and while the pain of the past could not be undone, perhaps there was still a chance to move forward. The room was quiet again, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It was the kind of silence that allowed for reflection, for the possibility of healing. Edward sighed, feeling the weight of the years lift just a little. "I don't know what happens next," he said finally. "But I guess we'll figure it out." Jacob smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Edward had seen since he arrived. "We'll take it one step at a time, brother. That's all we can do." Jacob took a deep breath, preparing himself for what he was about to say. Edward, sitting across from him, still hadn't fully processed the shock of seeing his brother again after all these years. But now, as Jacob opened his mouth to speak, Edward sensed that whatever was coming next would change everything. When I left, I didn't mean to stay away, Jacob began, his voice soft but heavy with emotion. I didn't mean to disappear from your life. I wasn't running away. Edward frowned, confusion furrowing his brow. Then what happened, Jacob? Where did you go? Why didn't you come back? Jacob hesitated, his hands clenching into fists in his lap. I didn't know how to come back, Edward. For a long time. I didn't even know who I was. Edward blinked, his heart skipping a beat. What do you mean? Jacob's eyes clouded with memories, painful ones, fragments of moments that he had struggled to piece together. I had an accident, he said quietly. About a year after I left. It was a bad one. I don't remember much from that time, but I know I was alone. No one was looking for me. And when I woke up, I didn't know my own name. Edward's breath caught in his throat. He had never considered this possibility. The anger, the resentment he had held onto for so long began to unravel, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. Amnesia, he whispered. Jacob nodded, his gaze distant. The doctors didn't expect me to recover. I was found wandering along a road, badly injured. They said I had been in a car crash, but there was no identification on me, nothing that could tell them who I was. I spent months in the hospital, trying to remember anything about myself. My name, my family, where I came from, it was all gone. Edward leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as he tried to process this revelation. But, how did you find your way back? Jacob sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. It wasn't until years later that pieces of my memory started coming back. Little flashes, here and there. At first, they didn't make sense, a house, a name, your face. But I couldn't connect them. I lived under a different name, in a different place, for so long. I didn't even know what was real anymore. Edward's mind raced, trying to imagine what it must have been like for Jacob. All those years of living with a blank slate, lost and disconnected from everything he had once known. The thought of it was unbearable. It wasn't until about a year ago that things started to change, Jacob continued. I don't know what triggered it, but one day I woke up, and everything came rushing back. The memories of our childhood, our parents, the day I left. I remembered it all. And I realized I had to find you. Edward's throat tightened with emotion. The years they had lost, the pain of separation, it had all been beyond Jacob's control. He had spent so long thinking that Jacob had chosen to abandon him, but now he realized that Jacob had been lost in more ways than one. Jacob looked up at Edward, his eyes filled with regret. I wanted to come back sooner, but I was scared. Scared of what you would think of me, scared of facing the past. But I couldn't let another day go by without telling you the truth. Edward sat back, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. He had imagined so many scenarios over the years, but never this. He had thought Jacob had left by choice, out of selfishness or anger. But the reality was far more tragic. Jacob had lost himself, and with him, everything he had once known. For a long moment, neither brother spoke. The weight of the truth hung heavy between them, but it also opened a door, a chance for understanding, for healing. Finally, Edward broke the silence. You didn't have to be scared, he said softly, his voice filled with the compassion he hadn't felt in years. I wish I had known. I wish I could have helped you. Jacob's eyes glistened with tears, the vulnerability of the moment clear on his face. I didn't know how to ask for help, Edward. I barely knew how to help myself. Edward reached out, placing a hand on Jacob's shoulder. You're here now. That's what matters. We can figure the rest out. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jacob allowed himself to breathe deeply, the tension of the past slipping away. He had carried the burden of his lost years alone for too long, but now, sitting beside his brother, he finally felt the possibility of peace. Jacob sat quietly on the porch, the weight of his fragmented memories pressing down on him. He had spent days trying to piece together the final moments before the accident, and while some things were still a blur, one detail had begun to sharpen in his mind. "It wasn't an accident," Jacob said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Edward turned to him, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Edward asked, sitting up straighter in his chair. Jacob's brow furrowed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he tried to gather his thoughts. "The crash, it wasn't an accident. I didn't just lose control of the car. Someone else was there that day." Edward felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Who? Who was there?" Jacob's face was pale, the memory creeping back into focus. "I remember, a man. He came up to the car, right before it happened. He was yelling at me, saying something I couldn't make out, but I knew he was angry. There was a struggle, and then everything went dark." Edward's heart pounded. "A man? Do you remember who it was?" Jacob shook his head, frustration tightening his features. "I don't know. I never saw his face clearly. But I remember his voice. He was someone we knew. Someone from our past." Edward stood up, pacing the porch as the revelation settled in. The idea that Jacob's disappearance hadn't been the result of an accident, but something more deliberate, shook him to the core. "Are you saying someone tried to hurt you? Someone we knew?" Jacob nodded slowly. "Yes. And I think it was tied to Dad." Edward froze in his tracks. "Dad? What are you talking about?" Jacob leaned forward, his voice low, as though speaking the words aloud made them more real. "Before I left all those years ago, I was digging into Dad's old business. I found some things that didn't add up. He wasn't the honest man we thought he was, Edward. He had dealings with people, dangerous people. And I think they came after me because of it." Edward's mind raced. Their father, a man they had both looked up to, had always been a pillar of strength and integrity. The thought that he could have been involved in something criminal was hard to accept. "What kind of dealings?" Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure," Jacob admitted. "But I found documents, payments, contracts, things that didn't make sense. I confronted someone about it, someone Dad had worked with, and that's when everything started to go wrong. The man who came after me that day. I think he was trying to silence me." Edward's head spun with the implications. Their father's legacy, everything they had believed about him, was suddenly called into question. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, a mixture of hurt and disbelief in his voice. "I was trying to protect you," Jacob said, his voice filled with regret. "I thought if I could figure it out on my own, could stop it before it got worse. But I was wrong. After the accident, after I lost my memory, I didn't even know what I was running from anymore." Edward stared out at the horizon, the sun dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The past, it seemed, had not only stolen his brother from him but had been hiding darker secrets all along. Their father's hidden life had led to Jacob's disappearance, and now, after all these years, the truth was finally coming to light. Jacob's voice broke the silence again. "I know it's hard to believe, Edward. I didn't want to believe it either. But I think that man is still out there, still connected to the mess Dad left behind. And now that I've come back, he may come after me again." Edward clenched his fists, his mind reeling from the weight of it all. His father, the man he had idolized, had left behind a trail of secrets and danger. And Jacob had been caught in the crossfire. But Edward knew one thing for certain: this time, they wouldn't face it alone. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Edward said firmly. "Together." The revelation about their father's secret life weighs heavily on both Edward and Jacob. Edward, who had always idolized their father, struggles to reconcile this new information. He feels a deep sense of betrayal, questioning everything he once believed about his father's values and the life they had growing up. His initial reaction is anger and disbelief, but as he processes it, he feels a profound sadness, mourning the loss of the image he had held onto for so long. Jacob, on the other hand, is more focused on the present danger. His memory of the man from the past becomes clearer, and he's terrified that this person could still be out there, waiting to finish what was started. He regrets not having faced this sooner, and now feels a deep responsibility to protect Edward from the consequences of their father's actions. The brothers share a moment of quiet understanding. They've both been hurt by the past, but they're determined to face whatever comes next together. They decide they need to dig deeper into their father's old dealings, but the question lingers: how much truth do they want to uncover? As they work together to investigate their father's hidden life, Edward and Jacob begin to heal their broken relationship. Their bond strengthens as they navigate the uncertainty of their past, and for the first time in years, they begin to trust each other again. Edward takes on a more protective role, no longer harboring resentment toward Jacob for his disappearance, and instead focuses on supporting him through the dangerous situation they now face. Jacob, in turn, starts to regain his confidence. He's no longer the lost man he was after the accident, and his memory becomes sharper each day. He opens up more about the things he remembers, helping Edward understand just how deep their father's connections went. The brothers are no longer just piecing together their father's past, they're also rebuilding their own sense of family and closure. However, the looming threat of the man who caused Jacob's accident weighs heavily on them both. They realize that confronting the past won't be easy, and they'll need to decide whether to pursue the truth at all costs or let it go for the sake of safety. The days following the revelation about their father's hidden dealings were filled with a quiet tension. Edward and Jacob spent hours poring over old documents, trying to piece together the connections between their father's business and the man Jacob had remembered. The search was slow, frustrating, and filled with dead ends, but then they found it, a name that tied everything together: Henry Dawson. It was in an old letter, hidden in the back of one of their father's ledgers. The letter was brief, but it was enough to send a chill down their spines. It was a veiled threat, written to their father in the weeks before Jacob's disappearance. Dawson had warned him about reneging on a deal, mentioning debts that were long overdue. The implications were clear: Dawson had been involved in their father's business, and something had gone very wrong. As Jacob read the letter aloud, his voice trembled slightly. "Look at this part," he said, pointing to a specific line. "If you think you can walk away from this without consequences, think again. You'll be lucky if your family doesn't pay the price." Edward's face tightened, the words gnawing at him. "Do you think this is connected to your accident? To why he came after you?" Jacob nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "It has to be. I didn't remember at first, but the name. Dawson. It's familiar. I think he's the one who confronted me that day, the one who caused the accident." Edward ran a hand through his graying hair, pacing the room. "This is all connected to Dad, isn't it? He got mixed up in something dangerous, and Dawson took it out on you." Jacob sighed, folding the letter and setting it down on the table. "It looks that way. But what I don't understand is why. Why come after me? What did I have to do with it?" Edward's jaw clenched as he looked at his brother. "Maybe because you started digging into Dad's business. Maybe you got too close to something Dawson didn't want anyone to find." The room fell silent as they absorbed the weight of the discovery. Their father, the man they had both trusted and admired, had led a double life. And because of it, Jacob had lost everything: his memory, his freedom, his connection to his family. "We need to find him," Edward said suddenly, his voice firm with determination. Dawson. We need to confront him. Jacob looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You really think that's a good idea? After everything he's done? Edward's gaze was steady. We need answers, Jacob. If this man is still out there, we can't just let it go. Not after what he did to you. Jacob hesitated, the memories of the accident flashing through his mind. But deep down, he knew Edward was right. They couldn't move forward without confronting the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. I found an address, Edward continued, handing Jacob a crumpled piece of paper. He's living in a suburb not far from here. I don't know if it's the same Henry Dawson, but it's worth a shot. Jacob stared at the address, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. After all these years, they were finally going to get some answers. He nodded slowly, folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. Let's do it, Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with apprehension. Later that evening, they drove in silence, the road stretching out in front of them as they headed toward Dawson's house. The air was thick with unspoken tension, both brothers lost in their own thoughts. Jacob's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white from the pressure. Edward glanced over at him, noticing the tightness in his expression. You all right? Edward asked softly. Jacob nodded, though his voice was strained. I'm fine. Just thinking. Edward didn't press him further. He understood the weight Jacob was carrying, years of unanswered questions, memories slowly resurfacing, the fear of what they might uncover. But they had come too far to turn back now. As they pulled up to Dawson's house, a modest one-story home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, Jacob's stomach twisted into knots. He parked the car and stared at the house for a long moment, his heart racing. This is it, Edward said, his voice low. You sure you're ready for this? Jacob swallowed hard, nodding. Yeah. Let's get it over with. They approached the house cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the evening. Jacob's mind raced with fragments of memories, flashes of the man's face, the sound of his angry voice from that day. He had tried to forget for so long, but now it was all coming back in painful clarity. Edward knocked on the door, his hand steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. They waited, the silence around them growing heavier with each passing second. Just as Jacob was about to suggest they leave, the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Henry Dawson, older, frilier than Jacob remembered, but unmistakably the same man. His eyes, though sunken and tired, still held a sharpness that made Jacob's stomach churn. Can I help you? Dawson asked, his voice rough with age. For a moment, neither brother spoke, the weight of the years hanging between them. Then Jacob stepped forward, his voice tense but controlled. You don't remember me, do you? He said, his gaze locked on Dawson's. Dawson squinted, studying Jacob's face, and then a flicker of recognition passed through his eyes. Jacob, he muttered, his voice trailing off. I thought you were dead. I almost was, Jacob replied, his voice tight with emotion. Because of you. Dawson's expression darkened, but there was no sign of surprise or denial. He knew exactly what Jacob was talking about. What do you want? Dawson asked, his voice suddenly defensive. We want answers, Edward said, stepping forward. We know about the deals you made with our father. We know about the threats. And we know you're the reason Jacob disappeared. Dawson's lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes narrowing as he leaned against the doorframe. Your father owed me more than he could ever repay. He got in over his head, and he tried to walk away. But no one walks away from a deal like that. Jacob's hands clenched into fists, the anger he had buried for so long rising to the surface. So you came after me instead? You ruined my life, you destroyed everything, because of something Dad did? Dawson's gaze didn't waver. Your father made his choices. He knew the consequences. And yes, you were part of the price he had to pay. Edward's jaw tightened, his voice cold with fury. You could have killed him. But I didn't, Dawson replied evenly. And if you've come here to settle the score, you'll find I'm not the same man I used to be. I'm not worth your revenge. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but it wasn't revenge that Edward and Jacob were after, it was closure. Jacob stared at Dawson, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The years of anger, confusion, and lost time swirled inside him like a storm. Everything he had gone through, the memory loss, the isolation, the pain, came back in a rush. And now, standing face to face with the man who had torn his life apart, Jacob found it difficult to contain the fury boiling within him. You ruined everything, Jacob said, his voice trembling with emotion. You didn't just come after me, you stole years of my life. Years I'll never get back. Dawson didn't flinch. He remained steady, leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face a mask of indifference. Your father owed a debt, Dawson said coldly. And debts have to be paid. Jacob took a step forward, his heart pounding. So you decided to punish me for his mistakes? I had nothing to do with his business. I didn't even know what was going on. That doesn't matter, Dawson replied, his voice flat. Your father's failures became yours the moment he couldn't pay. I warned him, but he thought he could outsmart us. Edward, standing beside Jacob, couldn't hold back his anger any longer. You didn't just destroy Jacob's life, you destroyed our family. You turned our father's mistakes into a death sentence for his own son. And now you expect us to just walk away? Dawson's eyes darkened, but there was a weariness in his voice now, as though he had long since given up the fight. I'm not the man I used to be, he said quietly. And your father wasn't either, by the end of it. He was broken, desperate. I never wanted things to go this far, but once the wheels were in motion, there was no stopping them. Jacob felt a wave of bitterness rise in his chest. The man standing before him was not the powerful figure he had feared for so long. Dawson was just a shadow of his former self, an aging man clinging to a past that had already crumbled around him. Why now? Jacob demanded. Why didn't you finish what you started? You left me to die, but I survived. Why didn't you come after me again? Dawson's eyes flickered with something, regret, perhaps, or just the weariness of a man who had lived too long with his own guilt. Because it wasn't worth it, he muttered. By the time I found out you were still alive, it was too late. Your father was gone, and there was nothing left to gain. I didn't care anymore. Jacob stood there, stunned. He had spent years looking over his shoulder, running from shadows, and all this time, Dawson had simply let him go. The weight of it pressed down on him, making his anger feel almost hollow. Dawson wasn't the villain he had imagined, he was just a man, a broken man whose actions had spiraled out of control. Edward stepped forward, his voice softer now. You may not care anymore, Dawson, but we do. We came here for answers, and now we have them. But that doesn't erase what you did to our family. Dawson's gaze flicked between the two brothers, a tired sigh escaping his lips. Then what do you want from me? Revenge? Justice? You think dragging this old man out into the street is going to make any of it right? Jacob shook his head, the anger draining out of him, replaced by something far more painful, acceptance. No, he said quietly. I don't want revenge. I just wanted to know why. Dawson studied Jacob's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Now you know. The silence that followed was thick with emotion, but the tension had begun to dissipate. There would be no violent confrontation, no final act of revenge. The truth had been laid bare, and while it didn't make the pain disappear, it gave Jacob and Edward the one thing they had needed for so long, closure. I don't want to see you again, Jacob said, his voice steady but firm. I don't care what happens to you now, but I need to know that this ends here. No more threats, no more debts. It's over. Dawson nodded, his shoulders sagging as though a great weight had been lifted from him. It's over, he said, almost in a whisper. Jacob turned to Edward, who gave him a nod of support. Together, they walked away from the house, leaving Dawson standing in the doorway, a relic of a past they had finally left behind. As they drove back in silence, the weight of the day hung heavily in the air, but there was also a sense of peace. For the first time in years, Jacob didn't feel the looming shadow of his past. The truth, painful as it was, had finally set him free. Edward glanced over at his brother, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It's really over, isn't it? He asked quietly. Jacob nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Yeah, he said softly. It's over. They still had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, it felt like a road they would walk together, not burdened by the past, but looking forward to the future. A few months later, the brothers stood side by side at the edge of a quiet lake, their childhood fishing spot. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the water. Neither of them spoke, but there was no need for words. They had found their way back to each other, and that was all that mattered now. Thank you for joining Edward and Jacob on their emotional journey of loss, discovery, and reconciliation. Their story reminds us that no matter how dark our pasts may be, there is always a path toward healing and closure. If this story moved you, share your thoughts and reflections. How do you think unresolved family secrets shape who we become? What would you do if you were in Jacob or Edward's shoes? Your voice matters. Join the conversation and help others find hope and healing through stories like this one. Share your thoughts and spread the message of forgiveness, family, and redemption.